Hello everyone, welcome to the third Exploring Research seminar in our spring programme at Wellcome Collection, Picturing the Asylum with Dr Kat Rawling. Thanks for joining us live today, whether it's good evening, good afternoon or good morning for wherever you are. My name is Ross McFarlane and I'm a Research Development Specialist here at Wellcome Collection. For those of you who cannot see the screen, I have red hair, my pronouns are he, him, I'm wearing glasses and a blue shirt. I'm currently sitting in a room with bookshelves behind me. As the title of this series suggests, Exploring Research, these seminars explore current research that relates to our collections at Wellcome around topics that focus on how we think and feel about health. In this spring programme, we're focusing on material that we hold post-1850. So now it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kat Rawling. Kat is a lecturer in the history of science and medicine in the School of Philosophy, Religion. Key to Kat's research is historical inquiry into the role, use and meaning of photography in medicine and wider society. That really resonates with us at Wellcome Collection, and which is why we were keen for her to speak in this event series. Kat also leads the Social Photography Research Group, an interdisciplinary group of historians, psychologists, and young people coming together to facilitate productive cross-disciplinary conversations around social media photography and young people's mental and physical health. Tonight draws upon her research into the use of photography in Victorian asylums, which she has published on in 2 recent articles and which will be the subject of her forthcoming monograph, Photography in English Asylums, 1880 to 1914, The Institutional Eye. So, without any more ado, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Ross, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all at the Wellcome for inviting me to speak to you this evening about my research. Before I begin, in the interest of audio-visual description, my name is Kat Rawling. I'm a white woman. My pronouns are she and her. I have shoulder-length light brown hair and I'm wearing dark glasses and I have green eyes. I'm also wearing a green cardigan and a dark blue top. I am sitting in my office at home at my desk, and behind me are my overstuffed bookshelves that are probably far too messy to show everybody who's looking at me now. Throughout my talk this evening, I'm going to be showing you historical medical photographs of psychiatric patients that were all taken in the second half of the 19th century. It's possible that you might find these images difficult or challenging and possibly upsetting. These images are freely available through the Wellcome Collection, but they are sensitive ones. And there are important ethical issues to consider when reproducing any sort of patient image. And I'm more than happy to reflect on these when we get to the Q&A at the end of the talk. But for now, I would like to acknowledge my thanks to the people whose photos I will be discussing with you. If you are inclined to do so, please feel free to live tweet about the talk. However, I kindly request that you don't share screenshots of the presentation or the patient images on social media. Okay, so today I'd like to introduce you to the photographic practices at one particular institution, Holloway Sanatorium in Virginia Water in Surrey in the southeast of England. The surviving archives of this hospital are particularly rich and extensive, and they're held here at the Wellcome Collection and also at Surrey History Centre in Woking. And the Wellcome included these casebooks in their recent large digitisation project of mental health archives, meaning that they are now accessible to a much wider audience than when I first started looking at them when I began my PhD research in 2007. They are of particular interest to me because the surviving casebooks are filled with photographs of patients. And I'd like to show you some examples today as a means of talking about the camera in the asylum and the practice of photographing patients in the late 19th century. So what I'll show to you on the slides today are just a small sample drawn from the hundreds of photos that were taken of patients from around about the mid-1880s onwards. Now, my research period goes up to around about 1910, and this is for the most part due to the standard 100-year access ban, the closure of medical records for 100 years. So when I finished my doctoral research in 2010, 1910 was as far as I could go up to. The photographic records, in fact, continue beyond this point, and the sanatorium was still in use as a psychiatric hospital until the early 1980s. It closed in 1981. So to give you a little bit of structure for the talk today, I want to introduce you to the sanatorium and to make some general comments on medical photography. And then I want to discuss the Holloway Sanatorium casebooks in particular and draw out some of the observations I've made about them and the patient photographs that they contain. So we are very much in this talk going to focus on the photographic practices of one particular institution. And then finally, I want to reflect on what historians might do with these sources, how we might interpret them. They are very difficult and ambiguous historical records, but what might they tell us? And on the slide, you should be able to see one of the perhaps more unusual patient images from the casebooks. So this image is from casebook number 4 for female patients admitted from 1890 to 91. And here on the slide, we see a female patient standing in front of a large window. And although this particular photograph is quite faded and water damaged, we are able to make out that she is holding a book in her right hand and a collection of photographs arranged in a sort of a fan shape, like you would a hand of cards, in her left hand. And I like to use this image to help us start thinking about these very complex and ambiguous historical objects and sources. Here we have in this image a patient being photographed holding photographs. And I think that's a very intriguing combination of ideas that are kind of present in this one particular photograph here. So let's introduce you to Holloway Sanatorium. In June 1885, the Prince and Princess of Wales, along with over 1,000 other notable dignitaries, attended the opening of Holloway Sanatorium in Virginia Water in Surrey. And the Daily News, one of the contemporary newspapers of the time, described this much anticipated social event in quite minute detail, and I want to read an extract of one of those reports for you now. The sanatorium is but a few minutes' walk from Virginia Water Station. The lodge gates open upon the high road immediately beyond the railway bridge, and the visitor is at once in an enclosure of tastefully laid out grounds. There are 34 acres of lawn, garden and shrubbery, interspersed with old forest trees. The band of the Grenadier Guards and the Bijou Drawing Room Orchestra were performing on the lawn in front of the building, and tents and chairs stood invitingly under the shade-yielding branches. The royal party were first conducted through the rooms of one wing. The decorations of the hall are florid and bold. There are at the sides full-length portraits of great personages, the Prince and Princess of Wales, Gladstone, Beaconsfield, Wellington, Nelson, Cromwell, Shakespeare, etc. Ornate colouring prevails high and low. The decorations of the interior of the sanatorium throughout are done upon a principle. To use words from the address presented to the Prince of Wales yesterday, it is endeavoured above all things to avoid leaving a dimmed intelligence opposite to a blank wall. Another contemporary newspaper, The Standard, described the sanatorium with its gilded interior surfaces and vaulted ceilings as, quote, as great a contrast to the ordinary idea of a lunatic asylum as may well be conceived, end quote. And here we can see on the slide an engraving of the sanatorium grounds and building represented in quite a recognisable topographical style. The patent medicine manufacturer and philanthropist Thomas Holloway, 1800 to 83, founded the institution with a very clear aim in mind: to fill a gap in provision for non-pauper patients. That is, as one report noted, the doctor, lawyer, artist, clerk, or any professional breadwinner whose work cannot, like an ordinary business, be carried on by a deputy, and whose income ceases absolutely when he is unable to work. So as a result, patients were reasonably well-to-do. The men were commissioned military officers or professionals, while the majority of women were of no occupation or simply described as lady. A number of specific regulations were attached to the sanatorium, marking its difference from many of the large county and borough asylums that had been built after the 1844 Lunacy Act. The rules stated that no patient was to stay longer than 12 months. No patient was to be readmitted after being discharged. No incurable cases were to be treated. And finally, patients should be of the middle class or higher. I should add, however, that admissions data shows that these rules were certainly not strictly adhered to. Demand for such provision was predicted to be very high. Again, the Daily News reported that upon opening, applications for half the possible number of admissions have already been accepted. And by the end of the year, it is expected that the sanatorium will be full. So like other institutions for the insane in the 19th century, the sanatorium was regulated by the commissioners in lunacy, who conducted site visits, inspected casebooks, and required yearly reports from the medical superintendent. And here on the screen are images of the type of casebook that we're talking about here. A cloth or leather-bound large ledger with casebook embossed onto the front. And the smaller image on the right is a photograph of the flyleaf and the title page, the front page, and those signatures on the left are the signatures of the commissioners in lunacy. They would sign the casebooks to certify that they had inspected them. In the annual reports for the sanatorium, Dr. Sutherland Rees-Phillips, the first superintendent, gave details of changes and improvements, notable events, staff changes, and statistical tables relating to admissions, discharges, and deaths. In the fourth annual report for 1889, Rees-Phillips made note of several structural improvements made to the site, including the building of a more secure boundary between the grounds and the nearby train tracks, and the construction of additional blocks for excited patients. That year, the sanatorium was equipped with its own photographic room. Now, it has to be said that the sanatorium was by no means unique in photographing patients, and many psychiatric institutions adopted some form of photographic practice in the second half of the 19th century. This was, after all, described by many as the photographic age. So from its public announcement in 1839, photographic technology spread rapidly amongst professionals and amateurs alike. And by the 1880s, when the photographs I'm going to show you today were taken, the camera was a relatively accessible, affordable, and common cultural and material object. So as well as an increasingly popular amateur pastime and a thriving professional industry, photography rapidly became part of institutional record keeping and administration. The camera was also used by the criminal justice system and in colonial administration, where photographs formed an important and highly problematic component of ethnographic and anthropological studies. Practitioners in various branches of science and medicine were quick to take up this new technology and integrated the camera into their practice. Photography was used in branches of medicine like surgery, dermatology, and infectious disease. And the Wellcome Collection has large quantities of these types of photographic material. In psychiatry too, the camera was being used in various ways, and I think it's really useful here to see patient photography as part of a continuum, in a way, of attempts to visualize the so-called insane through other media like drawing, painting, sculpture. The visualization of insanity or madness itself has a long and complex history. And so on the slide there, I've just gathered some example images to show that there is, I think, a tradition of representing madness through different media, through drawing, through etching, engraving, sketches, and so on. So we have, for example, Charles Bell's Madness, produced in the early 19th century in 1806. In the top right, we have a drawing published in one of Esquirol's, a very prominent alienist in France, one of his publications, and this picture depicts the insane patient at a French asylum in a straitjacket. Then the bottom right, we have those sort of oval-shaped vignettes. These are from the frontispiece of Bucknell and Tuke's Manual of Psychological Medicine, which ran to several editions throughout the 19th century. It was a very influential text. And these images of individuals are designed to represent typology. So these are supposed to be the typical faces of individuals suffering from particular conditions. And then the bottom left, we have possibly the most famous of these four images, the Hogarth scene from the Rake's Progress when Tom Rakewell ends up in Bedlam. Dr. Hugh Welch Diamond, who was medical superintendent of Surrey Asylum and a pioneering photographer in his own right, photographed some of his patients in the 1850s, and he was very clear in the opinion that photography could be of great benefit to alienists and patients alike. So for the former, a patient photograph could jog the memory in cases of escape or readmission, as well as reveal the effects of mental disturbance on the face and body. For the patient, according to Diamond, there could be therapeutic benefit in viewing a photograph of themselves in their former state to help them continue to recover. And one of Diamond's photographs is on the slide there on the left. This is a young female patient depicting melancholy passing into mania. The image in the middle is one of Henry Herring's photographs. He was a photographer, not a doctor, and he produced a series of photographs of patients at Bethlehem Hospital in the late 1850s. And then the photograph on the right is one of the photographs attributed to James Crichton Brown. He was superintendent at West Riding Lunatic Asylum in Wakefield in the 1870s. And this particular photograph is one of the series of photographs that formed part of a lengthy correspondence with Charles Darwin while he was researching his Expression of Emotions book. So by the 1880s, when Holloway Sanatorium first opened its doors, many asylums and medical institutions were taking photographs of their patients as part of the clinical and administrative record, as part of evidence gathering, as part of research, as part of disease categorization and identification. And these photos take many different forms and vary in style and content. But the quantity of patient photographs produced suggests that taking photographs of patients was a relatively common experience in the late 19th century. However, there were no standard practices or rules for how it should be done. So as late as 1901, doctors were debating not only how to photograph patients, but whether it should be done at all. So if we're to say anything about psychiatric patient photography, then it is that it was experimental, it was fluid and evolving, making it a very ambiguous type of photograph for historians to study and engage with. Okay, so let's start focusing in, apologies for the terrible photography pun there, on the photographic practices at Holloway Sanatorium. So as a rule, it's generally difficult to find out who photographed patients for the casebooks, as patient photographs are hardly ever signed by the photographer. And this is often true for medical photos more generally. So at Holloway, the medical superintendent mentioned in his annual report for 1893 that the chaplain took some photographs of patients. The only initials that ever appear alongside photos are those initials of JBH, denoting Jane Buchanan Henderson. And it's unclear whether these initials indicate that Henderson was the photographer or that she was initialing their addition to the casebook in the same way as doctors initialed their individual case note entries. Henderson was a medical officer at the sanatorium from 1890 to 94, and her appointment to the position was rather newsworthy. The Manchester Times reported her appointment as follows. The lady doctors continue to make headway against prejudice. Their latest triumph is the appointment of a young Scotch lady, Miss J.B. Henderson, to a salaried position as medical officer at the Holloway Sanatorium, where she has been for some time clinical assistant. Miss Henderson's is the first appointment held by a medical woman at an asylum for mental diseases. Interestingly, Henderson in 1892 had been to Paris and attended the Tuesday lectures or Leçons du Mardi by Jean-Martin Charcot, the so-called father of neurology and prominent expert in hysteria. Photography featured significantly in Charcot and colleagues' clinical practice at the Salpêtrière from the 1870s, and Henderson wrote her personal reminiscences of Monsieur Charcot for the Glasgow Medical Journal when Charcot died a year later in 1893. So she was no doubt aware of photographic practices at the Salpêtrière, and it is a tantalising thought, I think, to imagine her attempting to recreate, perhaps, or reflect some of Charcot's use of photography in her own practice, though unfortunately there's no hard evidence to suggest that this was definitely the case. What I think this does show, however, is that the photographic practices at Holloway were part of a much wider discourse or context in which the camera was put to medical use. So as well as lack of firm information on who the photographer was, very few patient photographs are dated. And those that are tend to have the same date, suggesting that photographs may have been taken in batches. So my speculation is that a staff member or members had access to a camera and they tried to capture as many patients in one go as they could. So at some point it was decided that today would be the day for photographs. But as a historian, this lack of basic identifying information, this kind of the nuts and bolts of starting to analyse a source, this lack of those foundations of analysis seem, be a bit tricky. And it means that you have to do a lot of lateral thinking and put the images into as much context as possible. So some institutions had a clear method for patient photography, photographing all patients in the same way and placing the photo in the same place on the casebook pages. The asylum that I've studied alongside Holloway as a comparison, Newcastle upon Tyne City Lunatic Asylum in the northeast of England, is a good example of these sorts of standardised and uniform practices. And here on the slide are some almost random examples from patients admitted in 1890 of typical pages from the Newcastle casebooks, in which photographs are placed in the same position, towards or totally in the margin space, and patients are photographed in the same way, a frontal headshot, not unlike in many ways a modern day passport or identity photo. This was certainly not the case at Holloway. There are no signs of a clear system in which patients are photographed on or very soon after admission, and it was certainly not the practice at this institution to photograph patients on discharge, as it was the case at some hospitals or asylums. Furthermore, not all patients were photographed. Some were photographed more than once, some weren't at all. And in some cases, a photo was only affixed to the case note page after the patient had been at the sanatorium for many years, and in some cases after they'd been discharged. So the story at Holloway then is more complicated than the camera being used simply to gather identity records or to take before and after shots to chart visible signs of recovery. And it means that it's actually very hard to show you an example of a typical casebook page from the Holloway records, as there is such variety within the casebooks. So at the sanatorium, patients were photographed seated, standing, in beds, in the garden or by a window, in front of a white screen, with their arms outstretched, their hands over their face, screaming and shouting, or smiling for the camera. And some patients, like Agnes S., were photographed several times, while some were never photographed, despite being resident for many years. Some patients present themselves as if for a professional studio portrait, while others ignore or do not see the photographer, or, as in the case of a Caroline R., refuse to have their picture taken altogether. And in particular, the very first photographs taken at the sanatorium in the 1880s are indicative of the ways in which conventions of both photography and portraiture influenced institutional patient photography and medical photographs more generally. The photographs from the first female casebook for patients admitted 1885 to 89 show the influence of conventional photographic styles. Some patients are posed at the foot of steps, the balustrade and stone newel post helping to frame the composition, while others stand in the colonnade, perhaps holding a flower or arranging their body according to the conventions of photographic portraiture, their arms in feminine gentle curves or their hands clasped. Such images might challenge our expectations of what we might encounter while looking through a medical casebook. And I argue that primarily these portraits can be seen as portraits of elegant ladies before they're photographs of lunatics. And then when it comes to materiality, if we consider these photographs as image objects, which is really important to do, these medical images are also governed by what a photograph should look like. The rudimentary frame, drawn with a ruler and blue pencil, mark the patient photograph as a distinct and important element on the page, but also adheres to the convention that a legitimate picture has a frame. It is a sign of authenticity and validity. And I find a comparative approach a very productive one in my work, because it helps situate medical and patient photographs against a wider context beyond simply the medical record that they appear in. And so when we place the casebook photograph of Eleanora T on the left, taken in 1899, alongside a studio portrait of a young woman by a professional photographer in West Hartlepool, North East England, on the right, we can see that the angled three-quarter pose, so typical of photographic portraiture, is clearly active in both images, while one image is ostensibly medical and the other is non-medical, for want of a better term. But patients weren't always photographed alone, and there are some group shots of patients, especially in the earlier casebooks from the 1880s. So in these examples on the slide, several female patients are arranged rather conventionally, some seated, some standing, in an arrangement that it's not unusual to see in arrangement of a family group that appears in photo albums. And the photo is then pasted onto the casebook page. With the patient in question in this group shot being indicated by notations. So here we have the patient's name written above the woman standing at the centre back. Another sort of practice or method that compilers of the casebook used was that they would reprint an image from a negative several times, and then take the resulting prints and slice them up, cut them up to separate them into individual patient pictures. And this is what's happened with the example. What's happened with the example on the right. So we, at the top right, we have a group shot of several female patients, and then the patient who's sitting at the bottom of the steps in a subsequent print is then cut out and isolated and put onto her relevant casebook pages. So I think this is a sign of efficiency as much as anything else. So photographing in groups perhaps save time, photographing 7 patients at once instead of 1 at a time, and it may have also saved expense. But I also think that these examples give us the opportunity to consider whether these women in the photo spent time together, whether they formed friendships, whether they supported each other or otherwise. The casebook photos reflect changes in photographic practices and technologies as the 19th century came to a close. So in the first casebook, adequate light was a priority, so that many shots are taken outside in the grounds. And as we've seen, this had great advantages in terms of composition and framing. The grounds afforded rather attractive backdrops of pillars, steps, foliage, and so on. But as photographic technologies were refined to offer faster exposure times, the photographs are perhaps in sharper focus. Photographers were more able to capture animation or offer a sense of movement, even suggesting more spontaneity and less formality, perhaps in terms of style and pose. But then advances in technologies also meant that it was possible for more photos to be taken indoors. But despite these technological changes, practices, or maybe because of these technological changes, practices remained highly diverse. So patients were just as likely to be photographed inside against a custom-made white screen that we see on the right, as they were outside in the grounds on the left, with the male patient being photographed sitting against a wall, a brick wall outside, looking away from the photographer, and he's removed his shoes. Cases where the white screen is used is perhaps an attempt to neutralize the background, to make the images more clinical in some ways. However, I think the overriding thing that we can say is that there were certainly no hard and fast rules about where, when, or how patients were photographed. Several photographs include members of staff as well as patients, and these images, I think, can be particularly ambiguous. What is the role of staff members in these images? Are we seeing supportive or restraining hands? Do the staff offer comfort or coercion? And there are examples in the early casebooks of patients being photographed alongside the matron, who is identifiable in the image in the bottom middle and the top right. She's identifiable by her prominent keychain. And in the blue cyanotype image at the top right, it is the matron who looks directly into the camera, engaging the viewer perhaps, while her patient cannot or will not. It has to be said that images of staff are more likely to be peripheral glimpses. They are only partly unshot or have been cut out of the photograph post-production. They are a reminder, however, that the institution was a site of human interaction, a place in which relationships were formed, and a place in which power dynamics were at work. We might wonder to what extent photography was implicated in those expressions of power, especially when some asylum photographs show patients being held by the head for their photograph. How far did taking a patient photograph literally mean taking it from them? And here the potential violence of photography discussed by prominent theorists like Susan Sontag might help us interpret or reflect on these images. I've argued in my work that these examples are a visual record of a moment in the practitioner-patient encounter in its many varied and ambiguous forms, which I think takes them beyond a mere clinical record or evidence-gathering exercise and helps us consider patient and practitioner experiences inside the asylum. Now, so far I've said that patient photographs are ambiguous. They are certainly slippery and unstable objects. And we should think about the priorities and the agendas at work in any one image. Who is in control of the image? And again, that's something that can be said about analysing photographs more generally, certainly not just about medical photographs and indeed about psychiatric photographs. And I am much more inclined to view photography as a complex form of dialogue or negotiation rather than a one-way street in which the photographer, who in the case of Holloway and many other institutions was a doctor or a staff member, a one-way street in which a photographer always imposes their will on the passive subject. This dynamic or relationship is further complicated when the photographer was a member of staff, a doctor. So the act of photography potentially has a very intricate network of, or web of relationships going on between a doctor and their patient, between a photographer and their subject, between a subject and the self that they present to the camera lens. Several of the photographs suggest patients who were self-assured and comfortable in front of the camera. They bring with them, I think, a knowledge of how one should pose for a photographic portrait, possibly because they had posed for photographs outside the asylum. But what might we conclude or infer from photographs like these? So the two patients at the top of the slide there clearly know how to pose for a photograph, how to present oneself. They are apparently at ease in many respects. Now, of course, this complicity may be enforced, but it could equally be a form of resistance, resisting perhaps the burden of looking mad. Historian Barbara Brooks notes the case of one female patient in New Zealand's Seacliff Asylum who, when asked to sit for her portrait, responded, "I suppose you want a picture of a madwoman. I'd better stick some straw in my hair and make faces." Moreover, there are several examples of more overt resistance or refusal. In 1899, Selina W. subverted the usual photographic process by insisting on wearing a veil to protect her from the electricity that might come from the camera. And others might refuse to have their picture taken altogether, as in the case of several patients at Holloway Sanatorium, like Caroline R., who I've mentioned, Emma S. and Sybil P., all patients in the late 1890s. And the line in Caroline's case notes that reads, "obstinately refuses to have her picture taken," is one that I think reveals a sense of frustration or exasperation on the part of the recording medical officer. Again, the issues of potential patient resistance and compliance muddy the waters of medical photography and add to their ambiguity as sources. For every photograph in which a patient looked away, closed their eyes, or refused to sit in front of the camera, there are many more that show patients seemingly at ease with the process, smiling or presenting themselves as one should for one's portrait. Quite often, the historical and indeed popular narrative of asylums takes up quite clear-cut positions that see the institution as always oppressive and assumes that patients are therefore always resistant to that oppression. And I think the photographic record of asylums reveals a more complex story. There is resistance, yes, there's refusal, but also there's compliance, cooperation, signs of patients shaping their own experiences. And as visual moments in the practitioner-patient encounter, casebook photos can remind us that the asylum was a place of human relationships and interaction. Whose decision was it that Eleanor M. should be pictured holding her own photographs? Did the medical officers encourage or tolerate her posing in this way? And if it was her choice, why did she choose those particular items? As viewers of this photograph 130 years later, what do we bring to its meaning when we view it? For well over 30 years now, historians have been trying to recover the elusive patient voice. And for the history of mental health and its institutions, this means prioritising the role of patient experience, patient agency, patient narratives, perhaps over those of the institution or the authorities themselves. Patient photographs, I argue, can be a way of accessing this patient experience on some level, or at least can offer a new way of thinking about it. Thank you very much for your attention this evening, and I am very much looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kat, for that talk. It was wonderful to hear how you put the images in so many contexts, not just the context of the volumes of casebooks themselves, but that context of the wider frame of the history of photography in asylums and in mental health care. A quick question from me before we take some of the questions that have come in from the audience. Just maybe for you to reflect on how you've done the research on these casebooks. You said at the start of the talk about how when you first used them, you were physically coming into the Wellcome, you were in the rare materials room handling the casebook, and now through time they are physically available free on the web as digitised resources. Do you think your research may have been different if it had just been the digitised images and you hadn't have had access to them when you began looking at this area?
That is a really good question, thank you. And it's one of those kind of perennial questions as historians reflect, and other researchers, other scholars reflect on the impact of digitisation on these archives. I remember when I found out that these casebooks had now been digitised, I was like, oh, great. All those hours transcribing case notes in the rare materials room, and hour after hour. Like, God, it would have been loads easier if I'd just been able to flick through the casebook on my computer. But I think, it's the classic historian's answer, isn't it? There is something about being able to handle those archives yourself. And one thing that I really try to foreground in my research is the materiality of these photographs. So they're not just representations or depictions of something that was there. The photographs have edges, they have a reverse. Some are cut into amazing shapes. Some are just shoved in between the pages. Some have pins and paper clips holding them in. And so I think that materiality is so important for their meaning, because it's being able to touch and handle those particular images that informs part of their meaning. And this is, I've reflected a little bit on what it might mean to consider the medical casebook as a photographic object, much like a scrapbook or an album. And I think, and again, that's one of those examples of placing the medical archive in its much wider context. And here we see parallel photographic practices, the cutting, the shaping, the integrating images with text and so on, the making a page with image and text. But also that really helps us think about the sort of embodied experiences of what it might have been like to be a medical officer compiling the casebook, reading the casebook, going back to review patient notes and coming across the photograph, that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to, even if we are only encountering the digitised versions, to try and think about that materiality and what it might be like to handle those particular objects. That's why it's very useful on a catalogue to see dimensions and scale. You don't get the weight of these casebook ledgers unless you've been in the rare materials room and had to kind of cart them over to the foam blocks. So I think it's, in an ideal world, you would do both.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's that experience as well of certainly for them to become digitised objects, how colleagues at Wellcome photographed them was so important and so carefully done, and are brilliantly skilled colleagues in that, to capture that sense at times, because there's letters, there's notes, as well as the
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it would have been so easy to not take the time to do that, I think, because, you know, there's a lot of work to photograph every single page, but the fact that every single side of a letter or an object is photographed is absolutely vital. I was in Rare Materials one day, and you know, photographs aren't the only objects that are in these casebooks, other types of documents. There are temperature charts, there are suicide warnings, and so on. And one of the temperature charts, which is the long kind of landscape piece of paper, graph paper, was folded concertinaed so that it would fit inside the casebook. When I unfurled that, there was a patient photograph underneath it. And, you know, it's that whole kind of classic, the revelation of the archive sort of experience. But it was so important that when they were digitised, that was captured as well. And so you can see in the digitised casebook that the photographers have unfolded that temperature chart so that the photograph of the female patient is revealed.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just I could just then we could go off discussing Victorians not pondering archivists and researchers many years in the future, and difficulties of fold-outs in Victorian books and scrapbooks cases. But we should leave that for another time, because we've got some questions from the audience as well. And the first one, partly covered in the talk, but maybe we could stretch it out a little bit. And the first question: was patient autonomy as important in the medical field as it is now? Did the healthcare staff require patient permission to take photographs? And, you know, there's been a bit of discussion in your talk about that. I'll just add the sort of addendum to that there about the ethics there, ethics in that relationship between staff and patients. Maybe to add to that question, and take it as you see fit, Kat, about the ethics of us now in the 21st century with these materials and their digitised use, and maybe the why you said at the start about not sharing them on social media through the talk.
Yes, so that is a very good question from the audience, thank you. And it does point to those very thorny ethical questions that my friends and colleagues and peers are grappling with right now. Increasingly, there are conversations amongst researchers about how we deal with sensitive stuff and what our responsibilities are towards our historical subjects, but also to our audiences and to ourselves as researchers. As far as contemporary notions of consent go, I think we may often assume that because consent certainly didn't exist in the 19th century as it does in its current form, it was therefore completely absent. And I don't think that is the case. As with all these things, they have a history themselves, terms change, legal frameworks change, and so on. But doctors were certainly aware of their patients while they were doing that, to a greater or lesser extent. So there's one really notable debate that happens at a meeting of the Northern and Midland Medico-Psychological Association, in which they're explicitly talking about the photographing of patients in asylums, and they're having a debate about it that reveals a high degree of ambivalence from those doctors about whether they should be doing it, whether it's harmful to the patients, whether there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. If they've established that it's okay to photograph patients, what's the right way to do it? So I think that's and the level of ambivalence in that debate certainly revealed that doctors were not blind to these types of ethical questions, and I think it's important to remember that. But it's quite hard to work out what exactly the frames of consent were for these particular photographs, for example, because I haven't been able to find anything where a doctor is actually saying what what they're thinking. I mean, one of the doctors in this debate thinks that it's absolutely fine to photograph patients as long as they don't know about it. which, kind of, and I think that is in part due to the idea that they need to get the most candid shot possible, which is a whole other talk in itself. But, that raises very interesting questions about debate and about consent, rather. But if we place this issue of consent again in the wider photographic context, ever since its invention, in the kind of popular discourse around photography, issues around consent, privacy, anonymity, breaching of human rights, and so on, is very kind of like active and sort of circulating the whole invention of photography in the first place. People are worried about those kind of street views of crowds and whether photographing the crowds is an invasion of individual rights and so on. So again, it's very useful to put this kind of quite discrete medical context in its much wider one of photography more generally. So that's a really rambling answer.
No, not at all, not at all. And it's, I think, just on that ethics as well, it's a point that you make in your article in Social History of Medicine. And it's something I've seen with a group of students at the Wellcome, taken there by another cat Foxall.
Yes, yeah.
Which is the evidence in the casebooks of a patient saying, and it being noted down, did not want their photograph taken.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the scales falling from eyes for those students, and for me when I saw it, just what that meant for that relationship between doctor and patient. Extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, and of course there are examples in other medical photographs of patients being anonymized through various means. So either identifying features blacked out post-production or during the photographic moment as well by artfully arranged materials, or or just focusing on a particular limb or part of the body rather than the whole patient. So I think that those moves to anonymize are speaking to those debates around kind of consent and privacy.
We've got a more specific question here which has come in, which was, I was wondering if you had the details for Henderson's medical education, and also saying amazing presentation, thank you so much for sharing. So have you got some more details about how Henderson came to be in Holloway time at Psychiatric?
Yes, so she was trained in Glasgow and maintained her Glaswegian connections all through her career, which I think is why she writes her reminiscences of Monsieur Charcot in the Glasgow Medical Journal rather than the BMJ or something like that. But interestingly, she ends up in Cape Town, I think. So you can see from the medical registers where the doctors have to give their kind of practicing addresses and that kind of thing, that she goes to either Cape Town or Johannesburg, and she marries over there and she dies over there. But in her obituaries, she sort of, when she's in South Africa, she sort of moves away from psychiatry into more sort of maternal and child health, I think, and gynecology and that kind of thing. So yeah, she has a kind of a like change of career pathway.
Yeah. Another one that's after a specific point, but we could widen that a little bit, which is how many patients were accommodated at Holloway in 1885? I mean, certainly you've given us a sense of the images of the scale of the building, and maybe was it say about how the size of the patient numbers altered over time?
So when it opens in 1885, I think it's got space for no more than 200 or so. And so that kind of little extract I read from the newspaper reports when it opens, when the doors opens, half of the place is taken. And certainly by the maybe second year of it being opening, they are full, and they are having to build extra blocks. So that's the block that the Sutherland Rees Phillips mentions for the excited patients, having to add on bits to accommodate all the patients. I mean, this was a private fee-paying sanatorium. So I think part of the space issue was potentially because each patient was allocated so much space within that big building. You know, the facilities were pretty high end, let's say. But I think there's a sense across the second half of the 19th century that institutions and asylums generally are filling up, because, you know, this is one of the debates at the time about, you know, is there an increase in insanity? And it's that classic question of, well, is insanity increasing, or are we just recording it more, or are just because now there's spaces for these patients and more patients presenting themselves, so on.
But you know, I just thanks. I was just getting the discussion to think of, maybe I'm looking at the time here as well. I mean, I think we're sort of coming to the end of the time that we've got for questions, but certainly a good one here, which is about drawing out the modern view of patient photography in medicine. And do you think there's any remnants of the practice of the 19th century in medical photography in the 21st century?
That's a good question. So I suppose the first thing to say is that medical photography now is professionalised and standardised, and of course with that professionalisation process there comes regulation usually. And so you can train in medical photography and you can be employed as a medical photographer in a particular kind of medical setting. One thing that I do think is interesting is, again, the use of technology here. So because of camera phones, digital technology, digital photographs, that kind of thing, again, we're getting this, it brings up the consent and ethical questions again. So there have been quite kind of infamous cases of doctors or other medical staff taking photographs of patients on their camera phones when they shouldn't have, when they clearly shouldn't have. And those people have been prosecuted for you know, the kind of the breach of patient confidentiality, as well as other things that represents. So what I think is very interesting is that changing role of technology and what that enables us to do with photographs in that kind of medical setting. I mean, I've been in a doctor's surgery and the smartphone, the camera phone has been almost another clinical tool in many respects. And in the 19th century, doctors were exchanging photographs between each other, formally and informally, exchanging examples of particularly good photos of certain things, exhibiting them and so on, and letting them publish each other's in their own textbooks and that kind of thing. And so digital phone technology allows that circulation of photos just in on another platform almost, which I think is quite interesting. Kind of takes me beyond my period a little bit, but there were good parallels.
But I think it takes you beyond your period, but it takes us into thinking about what we think of these images in the 21st century and the parallels that we've got. We've done that amazingly and clearly tonight, Kat. There's been a lot of other questions that have come in. What we're going to do, as I said at the start, is to get them together when you have the time as well, Kat, show you to them and show them to you, and hopefully get some answers to those questions we can send out along with a list of links, maybe to sort of pieces by you, but also the links to digitised casebooks too. I think so. As time has reached the hour, I best sort of start sorrowfully, quite frankly, because I could want to keep going through these questions with you even further. Bring things slightly to a close.
Well, I'm sorry I went on so long so I couldn't answer more questions. Many apologies. I will try and get to those questions and provide answers for you.
I think blame the presenter and the chair better than your good self, Kat, and my sort of verbal. But we're now at the time, unfortunately, there's no more time to answer any of the more questions here. As I say, we're going to record all of them and pass them on to Kat and get some answers in due course. Kat, just thank you so much for such a fascinating seminar. Some really kind and truthful comments have come through about how much the audience has enjoyed it. A couple of things I just want to flag out before we finish, and that's two blog posts that Kat has co-written as well around these notions of sensitivity in historical sources. So one, historical photographs as sensitive sources, questions and challenges, and that's on the blog of the Royal Historical Society, written by Kat and Dr. Beatrice Pichel and Dr. Jennifer Wallace. And also on the Polyphony, the wonderful medical humanities blog, an article called Picturing Medicine, Visual Material Culture, Historical Source, and that's by Kat and Dr. Harriet Paul Freeman. So as I say, that's us drawing to a close here for this seminar. Look out for details for the next one. The next in the series will be the 25th of May, and that's going to be Dr. David Griffiths, who's going to be talking to us about the Dave King Archive that we hold at Wellcome. And I think there'll be some rich debate to be had around notions of ethics and sensitivity with that archive, as it does get into details around ideas around sexuality and gender. It's an amazing collection, and I look forward to that talk too. But we'll leave that forthcoming attraction for the time being. Last thing I need to do is just once more thank tonight's speaker, Dr. Kat Rawling. Kat, thank you so much. And
pleasure.
Thanks for attending, and goodbye just now. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.